Welcome to the Mind.
What do we really mean by genius?
Matters.
Giftedness is so much more than an academic label.
Podcast.
We tend to think of gifted as kids being good at everything across the board.
An exploration of giftedness.
Originals are nonconformists.
Creativity.
People who not only have new ideas.
Intelligence.
They're the people you want to bet on.
In childhood.
I like to learn about things, but I like to learn my way.
And beyond. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I want to start off with a quick content warning. This is the first in a series of a very important and sensitive topic. We're going to explore what we know about depression and suicide in high-ability people. While most countries around the globe are seeing sizable decreases in their suicide rates, it's a really different story here in the U.S. How does giftedness affect the likelihood of dying from suicide? Are gifted and 2E kids more or less successful at completing suicide? We'll talk about what we know and what we don't know about this sensitive topic on this episode of Mind Matters. Stay with us. Before we get underway, a quick shout out to the new listeners who are just finding our podcast. We've been growing faster than ever before over the past couple of months, and that is largely due to you sharing us with your friends. So thank you so much for that. Our website is mindmatterspodcast.com, and once you're there, you can click the subscribe page on your mobile device, and you'll find links to all of the major podcast platforms. Also, we are super excited about the bonus materials we're going to be offering our Patreon supporters. For anyone who has just a few spare dollars a month to help us, we're offering bonus audio, opportunities to add your voice to the show, and more. You can join us at patreon.com/mindmatters. Today's guest is one of the most esteemed experts on suicide in gifted youth.
Hi there, this is Tracy Cross. I'm a professor at the College of William & Mary. I have an endowed chair in psychology and gifted education, and I had the great pleasure of being responsible for the Center for Gifted Education for 10 years now, and over the past 3 or 4 years, a very unique enterprise called the Institute for Research on the Suicide of Gifted Students.
Dr. Cross joins us next.
Previously on Mind Matters.
Hi there, I'm Christine Fonseca, and I'm the author of the upcoming book, The Caring Child.
What are some of the biggest changes that you see, and how do you think that's influencing the development of their emotional intelligence and empathy?
This generation of children from about 10 to college age, they are born into a world with smartphone technology. Most of us, when we were 16, we immediately went and got our driver's license, right? Mm-hmm. Kids today, average age of getting a driver's license is 22.
Wow.
With as little as 2 hours of screen time a day, we are beginning to see changes in just how the brain's being developed. That has huge consequences for how we process and regulate cognitive skills. It has huge potential consequences for our social and emotional development. It's something we're going to have to pay close attention to.
Look for episode 36 wherever you get your podcasts. This is the Mind Matters Podcast.
Between 1999 and 2017, the suicide rate in the U.S. among girls 10 to 24 years old rose from 3.5 per 100,000 to 7.5. In males of the same age group, the rate rose from 18.7 per 100,000 in 1999 to 26 in 2017. These are troubling trends, to say the least, and our guest today is here to put some of this into perspective. Dr. Tracy Cross holds an endowed chair, Jody and Layton Smith Professor of Psychology and Gifted Education, and is the executive director of the Center for Gifted Education and the Institute for Research on the Suicide of Gifted Students at William & Mary School of Education. He's published more than 150 articles, book chapters, and columns, made more than 300 presentations at conferences, and published 10 books. He is co-author of the book Suicide Among Gifted Children and Adolescents. Dr. Cross, thanks for being here.
Oh, I'm happy to be here.
So tell me about your entrance into this field and how you got interested in studying suicide and, brought you to where you are today.
I think like most people, I had a consciousness raising experience when I was young as information about a person who died by suicide made its way to me. And as a young person, you don't really have a good means to understand what that means, but it stuck in my head for a long time. I was around a lot of artists as a child. My family owned an art gallery and store, and so I knew many artists growing up, and every now and then one would die or die by suicide. And again, I was too early in my life to make sense out of it, but it stayed with me. So fast forward to 1994, I guess it was, so 25 years ago, I was working at a university, and the dean of the College of Education called me and asked me if I would go with him to a prom to announce to the students of a residential high school for gifted kids that one of their classmates had just died by suicide on the university campus where the prom was being held.
Wow.
And it was literally a block from the dance that was being had. So, of course, I went with him and admired him so for taking on that responsibility. Certainly other people could have made that announcement, but he thought it important to come from him. I learned that night that a previous suicide had occurred off campus some months before of a second student who had attended the school for a very short period of time. So we leapt into action, you might say. The dean created a task force to study and prevent suicide at this school. So colleagues and I studied the suicides, but that night in particular, one of the things that was done in a postvention was to identify different risk levels of other students at the school. So we could only use information we had at the time, and that was quite limited, but good work was done. And there were the groups that were the closest to those two boys and who were deemed to be at higher risk. And we sent counselors to the homes of several students that night to talk to the families of the children who we were, of some concern about, let them know what happened and why we were there and so forth. And one of those children ended up being a third person to die by suicide several months later. Late in the summer, the three of us from the subcommittee, the task force, spent a year and a half or so studying the three lives of the students who died by suicide using an approach called psychological autopsy. And we, of course, knew what we were doing was pretty novel, and we didn't have a lot to draw on in terms of things relating specifically to gifted students. A lot has been said about them, a lot has been written about them, but in actual data, there was very little to go on when you factor in giftedness. So we stayed determined and disciplined to not go beyond our data. And in these psychological autopsies, we learned quite a bit. And that set me on the course, because once I looked around at what existed and what didn't exist and what we could say and what we couldn't and how we might intervene, there wasn't much we could go on other than research done generally about the age group we were studying and suicide across the age groups. And so for the last 25 years, that's what I've specialized in. And I feel very fortunate to have had this opportunity. My team feels like it produces materials and things that are helpful these days, but so much work needs to be done that we're dedicated to it. And that's why I created that institute here at William & Mary.
When you look at the literature, there's not a lot of depth there specifically about suicide in gifted individuals. And I think that's something that as I've read your writing, something that you've kind of grappled with. What are some of the things that make studying suicide in gifted individuals especially difficult?
To start, our country keeps statistics, but the suicide of high ability or gifted students isn't a criterion on which they keep data. So it's really difficult to discern whether a person's death is in fact a death of a gifted student. So because I'm in that field, I have access to a lot of gifted students, and an occasional suicide occurs, and sometimes we're able to dig very deeply into their lives as one means of doing suicide. So in any case, what we've been left with is a group of thoughtful people who are doing their best to offer explanations for and trying to create an image around the likelihood of gifted children attempting or completing suicide.
So there are two main theories regarding gifted kids and suicide, and they're pretty much exactly opposite of one another. What is the premise of the first theory?
Gifted kids are more likely to be affected by suicidal ideation and therefore suicide. And the other side is that they're well suited for and built in a certain way that would reduce the likelihood of their dying by suicide. And again, the arguments are logical. They go on common information in the field. Trouble is just not research to back either side up.
Mm-hmm.
So I felt like it's been incumbent upon me to do some very practical research on trying to establish patterns of suicide ideation. From that, we do these psychological autopsies that are really quite intense, long term. For example, a manuscript of ours on the most recent psychological autopsy of a gifted, twice exceptional student is in press at the Roper Review. It's probably the paper I'm most proud of anything we've written, so it's yet to come out. We spent 4 years from start to finish doing that study and writing it up and everything. So the kind of research that's necessary to learn a lot takes a lot of time, energy, resources, expertise, etc. And, if you're a person who's choosing your life and how you want to spend your time, you're driven often, hopefully, by your passions. And there just haven't been a lot of people who would dedicate their career to this topic. So we keep plodding along.
You mentioned about those two camps. Giftedness is either a risk factor or it's a protective factor, one or the other. Do you lean more one way or the other, or do you have a different perspective with that? What are your thoughts? Is giftedness a risk factor leading to suicide?
I think the judicious answer there, the safest answer, is to say it's unclear. There are arguments on both sides. Making it complicated is this. In the same time frame that we're doing this research, there's been an explosion of different conceptions of giftedness. We're not living life today with a singular understanding of what giftedness is. For example, while IQ may have utility, and I would argue that it does, it is not the defining definition as it once was many years ago, especially across different talent domains. So if you think about giftedness in a very inclusive and diverse way, where you cut across different domains from kinesthetic examples like gymnastics to art and music, with our traditional academic subject matter in between, like language arts and mathematics and science and stuff. To answer your question, we have to consider things like passion areas people have, what they spend their life doing, what the nature of their career work is. Suicide rates tend to vary a lot when you look at adult populations by profession. And again, you don't want to overly interpret these things, and you can't generalize them easily into high school, say. And I spend most of my time on school-age kids through college. One of the things that I do is I go to parts of our country, what I call high-achieving communities, where there have been what we describe as suicide contagions, examples of multiple suicides in a community in a short period of time. I think there are lessons to be learned about aspects that influence a person's suicidality that come from where they live and when they live. And of course, that all happens within a culture in the United States that's quite different than other cultures. In some ways, suicidality is seen in certain countries as the honorable thing to do in the event of significant failure or embarrassment to family. And in some places, like in the States, it's been treated as breaking the law, and more recently as a mental health issue. So when you try to say, is giftedness a risk factor, you can't answer it easily. And if someone does, then they're shortchanging an awful lot of these difficult questions. Because I would say, if a person said, I believe that giftedness is a risk factor, I would say, well, how about for talented architects? Do you think that's a risk factor for them? And I think would find that the answer to this question could vary quite significantly.
I had a thought as you were talking, and you mentioned twice exceptional kids. And so while giftedness is not necessarily something that we can really determine as a risk factor. Do you feel like twice exceptional kids are more at risk? My gut says yes, more than just like a kid who is, I guess, just gifted, whatever that means. I don't know. I don't know if there's any data about that out there at all, though. Is there?
There's very little, but common sense will tell you that how people live their life within their society, if they're part of a group that through one means or another ends up struggling or being treated differently, then certain risk factors increase. Now, it isn't necessarily a function of the risk of the twice exceptionality in your case. Say they're dysgraphic. It isn't dysgraphia that might cast them in greater risk, but it might be treated, growing up, a very able person who has this quality, and the attention paid to you and how you're treated is based on a limitation that's a small part, an important part, of course, but a small part of the totality of who you are, consequently limiting so many aspects of your opportunities to do other things in school, outside of school. So you can imagine if a person is thought to be disabled in some way, how difficult their lives can be made.
Mm-hmm.
For example, one of the historic correlates of suicide, things that correlate with suicide, don't necessarily in any way cause it, was being a part of a gifted gay, lesbian, transgendered group of people. Well, even saying it that way doesn't do justice to the fact that that particular group is really made up of several groups of people whose lives have not been studied very thoroughly as groups, so we lump them together and try to draw conclusions about their lives. Well, in the literature about suicidal behavior, people who were seen as in that group had a higher incidence rate of suicide ideation and, in some studies, suicidality, suicidal behavior in the sense of attempts or completions. Well, it isn't being gay or lesbian that's causing it.
Right.
It's the life they experience and how mistreated they can be, and doors closed to them, and all the things that we know to be true from these kinds of pernicious stereotypes and all. So in any case, we tend to kind of study things in terms of correlates and then move towards factors and then try to look at actual cause agents.
Yeah, it's the trauma that comes out of those experiences that leaves that lasting effect and then impacts overall well-being, I think.
I think that's a fair statement.
Let's talk just about some of the characteristics of giftedness that either can lead to that risk of suicidal behavior. Like, are there some things that gifted individuals do experience that are just kind of part of that cognitive ability that might be associated with that, as far as you're aware, or even things that people perceive as characteristics of giftedness that lead to that risk?
Well, it's a good question. A person who writes literature for a living would be a language arts expert with those kind of skills and insights. A person who writes poetry has not only skill sets in languages, but has an efficiency such that with fewest words they can create a world for people that they can understand, sometimes in ways that are not easy to understand and can't be expressed through other means. That's quite different than your skill set being mathematics or the sciences or any number of other computer sciences. And so when you talk about gifted characteristics, it again depends on who you're stipulating is gifted.
Mm-hmm.
And because it's complicated that way, I'm always reluctant to say, yes, that there are things per se, but there is some interesting research by a person named White out of British Columbia who created this really nifty potential risk and protective factors among students with gifts and talents. Now, her original risk factors, protective factors among students generally. So what my wife and I did was we've tried to add to it things that are germane to gifted children in addition to the general ones. So, for example, it's quite often for high achieving gifted students to experience what we call upward comparisons. It can be from other students, it can be teachers, it can be adults. In other words, looking at gifted kids and their performance and commenting or in some way expressing opinions about whether it's a positive thing or a negative thing. You can imagine a group of let's say 11 and 12-year-olds commenting. And we do a lot of research in Ireland, and I like this term, slagging. Gifted kids in Ireland get slagged sometimes for their test performance. So they do really well in school on tests, and some of the other kids will, sometimes it's just kidding, but sometimes it's harsher than that. And even when it is just kidding, the long-term effect of that can be rather negative. So upward comparison is an example of something unique to gifted kids that other children just generally don't have that experience of. So we've been trying to build this model of suicidality about gifted kids that includes their lived experience, because I think that holds a key to understanding and preventing suicide. For example, we know from our research in personality, there's a higher rate of gifted kids who would describe themselves as introverted than the general population tends to. And it's not twice, but it's close to twice, according to different studies. I did one of these studies and found that almost 50% of gifted students we sampled, and we had a large sample, looked like they would be described this way, as introverted, and the other 50% more extroverted. Well, that kind of thing matters a lot because in the general population, it tends to be much more extroverted. So if you're an introverted gifted kid, and let's say your social skills are low average, and you've grown up with all this upward comparison, and let's say your family expects you to go to a good college, and you're hearing this burden that not only are you going to go to a good college, you're going to help earn the money so they can afford to send you to a good college. Then your experience base now, it screens things through that in a way that other kids aren't going to experience. It's one thing to be told to do your best or to work hard, but it's another thing to be told, in some cases, like we've studied, that mom and dad expect you to go to a specific university. Not a good university, but a specific university. And not only go to it, but get, substantial amounts of scholarship money. Well, those kinds of pressures tend to be more unique to gifted kids. Is it being gifted causing it? Not directly. It's really more of the interaction of how people perceive you, stereotypes about you, and the environmental sort of thinking of the day.
I agree completely with everything that you're saying. And that's one of the things when I'm talking either with families in my practice or when I'm doing speaking events, it's really about always trying to fit that square peg into the round hole. And the more you do that, the more damage that square peg is going to sustain. And does that mean that there's something wrong with it? Or is it just not the right fit? And I think that's such a big part of it for these kids is that they just don't always have the supports that they need.
Let me offer a broader take, but I can do it briefly. I think working with gifted children and working with children with disabilities and then seeing the intersection there, gifted students with disabilities, it's a really abrupt, in-your-face sort of acknowledgement that our desire to create systems of schooling that assume that we can consider children the same really needs to give way to a more sophisticated notion that there are really no two kids who are the same. And so we're trying to study them in ways to teach them effectively that I think is warranted because grouping makes sense for all sorts of reasons. But I've yet to meet any two kids who are the same. Their histories and interpretations and things are almost always completely idiosyncratic. And then you add them to the family structure, where they live, etc., and you realize you've got this mosaic. You think you've got a good, clear image of the person, but you look up close and you realize, my goodness, they're so vastly different that things like predicting suicide can be made incredibly tough unless you factor in, well, let's look at what their actual life has been. You mentioned the word trauma earlier. Of course, that's such an important aspect or category of events that can cause all sorts of problems for kids in their lives as they grow older. And learning how to manage that in a more proactive way than we've done in the past will help us with this issue of suicide, clearly, as it will help a lot of other things as well.
What about existential depression? I feel like that's something that we talk a lot about in the field of gifted education. Is that something that you see in connection with the research that you do?
As a person who was responsible for a residential high school for gifted kids for a decade, I believe that I saw really good walking, talking evidence of students who you would describe that way. I call it existential angst, especially in younger kids. By the time they got to high school age, if it was there, it could be seen as an aspect or a way of thinking about depression. When I write now, what I try to do is be clear that what I'm talking about is a high incidence or low incidence, chronic or episodic, so that people don't think that all gifted kids, say, have this or that or deal with this or that. And I would add this topic to that. I've seen some really persuasive examples of even 6 years old, 7-year-old children who it's tough to describe if you don't use these words, but I don't think it's a common descriptor of most gifted kids. But when it's there, it's there. And when it's there, it's very meaningful and very important to deal with. And I don't think adults handle it well when they see a very young person dealing with, struggling with, manifesting qualities of that sort of existential angst. We sometimes sort of blow them off as, well, they can't possibly be thinking that way or worrying about such things, etc. But I've just seen so much of it that I'm confident it exists. I just can't predict how common it is.
You mentioned earlier the model that you've developed, and if I'm correct, is called the spiral model of the suicidal mind of gifted children and adolescents. Do I have that correct?
I believe that's right. I say that because we sometimes change it. We're always looking for new ways of thinking about it. And, there's some really good writers who write about suicide generally.
Yeah.
I've added a couple things very recently that I think might have helped it a little bit.
Well, can you describe that for us a little bit?
Sure. Again, without a visual, I imagine some of this will be easy to imagine and some of it might not. So I was after trying to come up with a good explanation for how does our wonderful little child one day end up deciding to die by their own hand. What happens between being born and dying that way for gifted kids? So I thought about it for a number of years and came up with this idea of a spiral model. And it works in explaining things pretty well. So if you imagine a spiraling circle where people are living their lives up above the ground. And so they go about their business and they're engaging in things that are normal for their age group. And generally speaking, it's a relatively level plane above the ground. Well, things happen to us, right? We have a death of a loved one or a relationship breakup or something really goes badly for us. We have a financial problem. There's so many different things that can create kinds of trauma in our lives that, many of them are within age group kind of things, and then some come out of left field. So when we experience one of those things, let's say a 15-year-old first significant love and they break up, for that 15-year-old, that could be the most severe upset, anger, hostility, fear, doubt that they've ever experienced. It's very intense, and they typically don't have the human resources yet developed to know how to manage it. And I would say, as importantly, they don't have the experience to know that they'll have other opportunities in life, in all likelihood, to find a terrific person, if that's what they want to do, to have a partner in their life. They don't know that. And to not know that puts them at risk a little bit. Because that intense emotional pain is there for most people who die by suicide. So imagine the spiral. The person's on the spiral. They have this significant breakup. Now they're starting to go down the spiral a little bit towards the ground. They're in a decline emotionally. They may go through a period of time where they make poor decisions, where they don't eat well, they don't take care of themselves. So things can load up on this influence of spiraling down. Use of alcohol or any other sort of depressant drugs in particular. If a person has like a comorbid thing, like maybe they were depressed already or they have issues with anxiety, it could really push them along that downward spiral pretty fast if you're not careful. Fortunately, we have protective factors built into us as human beings. There are biological ones. that don't encourage us to kill ourselves generally. Plus, there are cultural ones, taboos about such things. And then you can add, family or friends or other significant others who rally around, hopefully, and provide care for this person. It could be help a church might offer. So we have these many protective factors that sort of bolster people in general in society to make their way back up to this safe plane. But if you don't, and you keep going down, since it gets smaller in its circumference from top to bottom, the speed picks up. So once you get to a certain point of decline, if certain things don't intervene, then you're going to end in suicide. We've amended our model recently to include, this is where we need to intervene. These are the kinds of things we can be doing. Now, sometimes you see suicidal behaviors within families, and within that family, you can argue there's both a contextual reason, but also possibly a biological reason. Like I said, if you have some of the precipitating factors, like you're by nature depressed, think about the difficulty. Well, you would know in your line of work, but some people go through their lives being depressed and not ever being diagnosed. And if you're an introverted, quiet person, when I was growing up, the term we used was melancholy. If you're a melancholy personality, people don't ever necessarily assume that you're depressed, but you could be depressed, and a lot of self-treatment happens with alcohol and other things. And so sometimes a significant event will cast us into this downward spiral, and then hopefully has the resources in terms of relationships and other things to work their way back up. And, I do want to be clear, almost everybody does. Mm-hmm. Most people do not die by suicide. It's a very small percentage of people who do. It's way too big, but it's a small percentage. And I attribute a lot of that to those things I just described. Now, in writing, of course, we can take time and spell out what all these things are. And there are some that in some of the research we've done using psychological autopsy that I worry about more than others. But this spiral model was intended to just sort of help people who are unfamiliar with suicidal behavior understand, well, how does a person get from what seemingly was a very normal sort of day they were having to killing themselves? And this is a fairly good explanation, I find. And the key for us, those of us who work with gifted children, is to factor in all these things about their lives that are both unique to being gifted, but also idiosyncratic. And if you look at them that way, then we can do a better job of identifying them in distress before things get too serious.
So, as we kind of wrap up our conversation, I'm curious, what do you feel like is important for people to know, whether they're researchers or teachers or parents? Like, what do you think is the next step for our field, or ways that they can support these kids? What would you want them to know?
A few things. One is to educate yourself that a lot of myths affect our behavior on the topic of suicide. Even many of my close personal friends don't really want to talk with me about my research. It worries them. It's unpleasant in a way. It's just not the upbeat sort of stuff that most of us would like to spend our time thinking about. So a few of the myths that we need to dispel for everyone is that talking about suicide increases the likelihood of it. That's something that's been widely held for decades and decades. So we need to get more comfortable understanding that talking about it can actually prevent it or help prevent it. And as I travel to different countries, I experience this over and over in different ways, that America is more open than many countries are relative to asking people questions like, are you thinking about killing yourself? In the training we do here at William & Mary for faculty and staff and students on suicide prevention, that's one of the steps in the training process, is to practice saying that so that it ceases being so worrisome to you. Okay? Another thing is, once suicidal, always suicidal. Well, that's really not in the best interest of anybody to believe that, because people will write off people who are known to be somewhat in a period of suicidality. And that's just not supported by research. A very small portion, very, very small portion of people who were suicidal, say, between 15 and 24, die by suicide when they're 60. Mm-hmm. It's just one of those myths, and so we don't want to give up on the people. Another thing is time. Think about our role in society as good human beings and the value of time. If we can add time to a suicidal person's existence, their likelihood of continuing goes up. Don't back away from them. Find ways to intervene. And if it means they end up needing to spend some time in a mental health facility, in my opinion, that's probably the best answer for them. Mm. I work a lot with educators, and one of the things that's been consistent in their voices over the years has been they don't know what to do, and they're afraid they're going to make it worse, so it's better not to do anything. And so we try to help them create caring schools by emphasizing that, in fact, unless they're licensed clinical psychologists or psychiatrists with a specialty in identification of imminent harm, their bar for acting is really quite different. Their bar is merely look for children in distress. And as most professional educators or counselors are really quite good at that. So what I ask them to do is look for those children. If you see anything that looks out of the ordinary, and we always talk about examples, then literally and figuratively put your arm around their shoulder and walk them to a counselor, someone who's better trained to be able to work with them and who also knows next steps. Don't own it, because you can't own it. You don't have the training expertise to do that line of work, but being eyes and ears can really go a long way to being helpful. Mm. Let me leave you with one concern, if that's okay.
Sure.
And I want to be clear that I only have some data for this. I don't have vast quantities of data, but one of our data sources when we do these psychological autopsies is our journals that the students themselves have kept. And in many cases for several months on a daily basis before they died. So we get a fairly good reflection of what their thinking is up until the day that they die. During that time period, they make plans for their death. And those who do tend to be very meticulous and detailed about those plans, much more so than general plans made by other people who are suicidal. Now, what follows is what concerns me. And if I had more data, I could speak to it more confidently. So I'm sort of asking people to keep an eye out for this. My fear is not that gifted kids have a higher incidence or prevalence rate of suicidal behavior. It isn't that. I don't think they necessarily think about it or worry about it more than the general population. I think they might be more successful dying with fewer attempts. Because most people who die by suicide make multiple attempts, and in many cases, many attempts before they die. And some people make many attempts and don't die. Well, in the studies we've been conducting, we found that the kids who kept these diaries, at least, these journals, there was about a 1 to 2 attempt to death ratio. And that's much lower than the general population, meaning they have fewer attempts for completions. And if I'm right, of course, obviously that's a grave concern and one that we ought to keep an eye out for. Why am I telling you this at the end of this? Something we might do as parents or as educators is if you know that a child is keeping a journal or some written account of their life, see if you can take a look at it. Try to work that out with the student or the child. But if they're, not okay with it, then I think you need to consider how are they doing generally. And if you're not seeing any concerns at all, that's one way of thinking about it. But if you are worrying about distress or a recent breakup or a grandparent dying or something along these serious lines, then I think you might want to read it and decide whether you need to intervene in some way. Because I worry that unbridled journaling for people who are already in a bad place without any intervention by people to offer alternative views of their life and what they might do and how things are going, I think it puts them in greater risk.
Dr. Tracy Cross, thank you so much for your dedication to this really important topic and for your time here today.
Well, this has been a joy. I'm glad to have a chance to talk about this subject. Obviously, it's very important, and we need to spread the word so we can do as much as possible to help keep these kids going.
Suicide is a hard topic to talk about, but it is so very important. Dr. Cross shared with us what the research tells us about giftedness and suicide, and it may not be what you were expecting to hear. I know one of the first things I heard when I entered the field of gifted education was about the risk for gifted students committing suicide. It's interesting to hear what the research says about it. It goes back to one of my common refrains. We have to look at the issue of suicide through the lens of giftedness in order to understand what other factors influence our high-ability kids to feel hopeless enough that they feel there is just no other way out. Ralph Waldo Emerson wrote, "When it is darkest, we can see the stars." The exploration of suicide within this series of episodes requires us to seek all of the information we have first, so we can find the solutions next. Thanks for listening.
How does it hurt? Like tearing up a hole inside you. For what it's worth, yeah, I know what you're going through. We're down in the dirt. You got me here and now we're together. You know how it hurts. The feeling this is never over. This thing we got is not forever. I hope that we can make it better.
The Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 1-800-273-8255. It's available 24 hours every day. Our thanks to Dr. Tracy Cross. If you'd like to know more about him and the work he does, visit the episode page at mindmatterspodcast.com. His book, Suicide Among Gifted Children and Adolescents, is available wherever you buy books. A reminder, you can support Mind Matters with a small monthly pledge at patreon.com/mindmatters, or you can make a one-time donation to our efforts via PayPal through our website. Just click on Donate. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris, and for Emily and Cooper the dog, thank you for listening.
You know how it hurts. The feeling this is never over. This thing we got is not forever. I hope that we can make it better.
Mind Matters is a production of Morris Creative Services.